Fox News alert right now from Fox News Global Headquarters in New York. We are awaiting the White House briefing set to start about 90 minutes from now. We expect an update on the government's response to the devastation caused by Irma.
But we also anticipate hearing more about a big dinner at the White House tonight, hosted by President Trump to address tax reform. And some of the guests invited are Democratic senators. We're covering all the news happening now.
Our number one concern today is with saving lives.
A crisis unfolding in places like the Florida Keys and Jacksonville after Hurricane Irma strikes.
We need to know who you are, where you are, and our people, we will come get you.
Across the Sunshine State, there are warnings that a return to normal could take weeks or even longer. Plus, the United Nations by the rogue regime. It's all happening now. But we begin with a Fox News alert. Florida residents beginning to return to parts of the state slammed by Hurricane Irma. And boy, did they get slammed. As FEMA estimates, 25% of the homes in the Florida Keys have been destroyed. Welcome to the second hour of Happening Now. I'm John Scott.
And I'm Melissa Francis. Crews now allowing people to return to the northern end of the Keys 2 days after Irma pummeled the islands with 130-mile-per-hour winds and heavy rain. But access to the lower Keys is still blocked with a major highway washed out by the storm. Crews now trying to restore road access and check the stability of the bridges that connect the islands.
If you're in the Keys, you've seen the pictures, the trailer parks. I mean, it's like everybody just tipped everything over. You're just praying that everybody's alive. We're still I've been talking to the people down there. We're still having in the Keys issues with getting the water started back up, sewage, and their power back up.
And that is really the case all across Florida. Heard earlier today on the west coast of Florida, they were saying it could be as late as the 22nd before they get power back fully restored. They hope to, on the east coast, have power restored by this weekend. That is a long time when you don't have lights, you don't have power. Food is getting more and more scarce.
When I lived in Miami, I once rode my bicycle from Homestead to Key West.
Really?
So I know that island chain pretty well, and they are very low-lying. They got a big hit from this hurricane. That storm surge came up and obliterated so much of the housing along the Florida Keys.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Phil Keating is live in the Keys with the latest on the destruction there. So, Phil, the gates opened at sunrise?
Yeah, some days it's great to be home. Other days, it is not. In fact, it is quite depressing. Otherwise, it's a gorgeous day in the Keys. Blue, very hot, the usual for September, until, of course, this scenic highways scenery is just dominated from north to south by tons and tons of debris, wreckage, and homes totally lost for good. Right before sunrise this morning up at Florida City, the most southern point on the mainland, that's where hundreds of cars lined up to finally, after being evacuated and in exile from their houses for a week, finally came back home. They could come as far down as halfway to Key West, Islamorada, and they have not been here for 6 or 7 days, and today's the day they finally see, is it as bad as I thought or not? We hooked up with Clay Crockett, a business owner who does parties and events, supply company, and he also has a hot sauce, Florida Keys hot sauce company. He got to his house, and sure enough, the storm surge got him.
It's not starting from scratch, but it's not far from. We've been in the off season for a type of business. Well, we've been in the off season. Now we're starting to get into the busy part of the season, and now that season for the events and weddings and it has all been, now it's been highly jeopardized. So that whole revenue stream just went down the tubes.
Now, the Florida Department of Transportation has been inspecting all of the bridges, more than 40 of them, connecting you from the mainland down to Key West. They've cleared all of them as being safe for drivers until you get to the lower 17 miles. So they've actually been inspected but haven't been officially cleared yet. Perhaps that could happen as soon as tomorrow or the next day. Certainly a lot of people are hoping that in fact does. But you must remember that cell service and power is spotty from Key Largo all the way to Key West, and from Islamorada all the way to Key West. expect zero cell service, zero power, no drinkable water, and zero sewage. So you can go in, see the damage, but most likely most people are then returning up the overseas highway to head back to the mainland and stay at a hotel or friend's house, wherever they've been riding out this very devastating Category 4 Hurricane Irma. Back to you.
Yeah, just looking at all the debris around you. Wow. Also, you know, we heard that a small Navy Armada is down there as well. Is that right? What are they doing?
Yeah, it's just smaller than a strike force. It's a group of warships, including the USS New York, which was built in part from salvaged steel from the World Trade Center. You've also got the USS Abraham Lincoln. That's an aircraft carrier. You've got a destroyer and a cruiser, and they're all here for humanitarian relief. They're all positioned right off of Key West. The main thing they can provide, since commissioners in Monroe County say nobody actually needs to be rescued, that's just not the case at all. And he doesn't even think a full 10,000 people stayed down in Key West. He thinks most of the Keys did, in fact, evacuate. But the best thing these ships can be used for is platforms, so you can ferry in and helicopter in supplies, and everybody who is down here and all of the returning residents are going to need those things: waters, foods, all of the essentials, because finally the convoys of food trucks and supply trucks will probably start coming in today. And that's another great thing. The overseas highway runs coming down south, right to left on your screen. We have seen super long convoys of utility trucks as well as FEMA convoys. So aside from residents, the rebuilding here is getting going. But I got to tell you, there is so much bulldozing and scooping up and hauling away that has to be done.
Wow. Phil Keating, thank you for that.
President Trump, who knows Florida pretty well, commenting on the devastation in that state this morning, praising those involved in the response to this disaster, saying the devastation left by Hurricane Irma was far greater, at least in certain locations, than anyone thought, but amazing people working hard. Let's bring in Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters and former president of the White House Correspondents Association, and Vince Colanese, editorial director for the Daily Caller and the host of WMAL's Mornings on the Mall. So, Jeff, the president is generally getting, or the administration maybe is generally getting pretty high marks for its handling of the twin hurricane response.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think so far the federal response, as well as the cooperation with local and state officials in both of the hurricanes, has gone well. He hasn't heard a lot of complaints, and he's been, very proactive on Twitter, which is his favorite mode of communication, to communicate with the people who have been affected by those storms throughout the country. So yeah, so far I think the response, both by the White House, the federal government, and the other state and local officials that have been involved, has been quite positive.
Fairly or unfairly, the Bush administration was tagged with an abysmal response, Vince, to what happened after Hurricane Katrina. Has this administration taken that lesson?
I think they have. I think the president looks back on that, and I think he looks back on any sort of response in American history that hasn't sort of lived up to the standards that it needs to, and thought, you know what, I need to be aggressive here. And in some ways, he's almost over-attacking. He's communicating minute by minute on Twitter, as Jeff was saying. He's regularly talking about that. He's already been to Harvey disaster area. Now he's going to have a chance in the coming days to go to Florida as well. And maybe, if the governor of the Virgin Islands is correct, we may see a visit to the U.S. Virgin Islands, an area that Americans should pay more attention to, of course, because it's one of the hardest hit areas, as its residents go door to door looking for food at a location that was absolutely savaged by Irma. And the White House making clear over the past few days that they're very much paying attention and that they're extending disaster relief efforts there as well.
But it is still early, Jeff, and that's another lesson that this White House needs to take to heart. We're a couple of days in. The storm has moved up into the more northern states, but a lot of power out, a lot of flooding, a lot of damage left behind. And if there isn't some kind of organized effort to help the people who are still in need of it, those attitudes could turn south pretty quickly.
Not to mention that recovery is going to take a very long time, and people will get frustrated by that, no doubt. So that will be a communications challenge as well as a funding challenge for this White House and the president going forward.
In the meantime, the president is inviting senators from both parties to dinner at the White House tonight. They're going to be talking about tax reform, we are told. Vince, is this a sign that some kind of a bipartisan deal could be in the offing?
Well, I wouldn't overread inviting 3 moderate Democrats to the White House for dinner, but what I would say is that both parties were shocked, I think, after they saw President Trump go ahead and extend the government's budget structure by 3 months with both Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And I think that's led to a lot of sort of pause in politicians in Washington, D.C., who now believe that the president may sort of be a wild card on his willingness to work with either party. He is not in any way hardline on working only with Republicans, and if he can get a couple Democrats to cross, then he can begin working towards using the reconciliation process to get tax reform passed. If he can get a few more Democrats to cross, then he can get a real tax reform package through with 60 votes.
There's been a real partisan logjam on Capitol Hill, well, in Washington for, I don't know, a decade or more. It's hard to say exactly when it got as bad as it is, Jeff, but could this be something that begins to break that logjam?
Well, I think it's very strategic on the part of the White House. I think it's a recognition both that they would like to have bipartisan support for tax reform and that they can't count necessarily on getting Republicans to get that over the finish line. And it's also interesting to contrast it with the strategy that was employed for health care reform. You didn't see the president going out and doing a tour or a sales pitch around the country for repeal and replace, and you are seeing him plan to do that now with tax reform. He's already done a couple trips about that, and there are more to come.
All right, Jeff Mason, Vince Coglianese, we'll be looking for some information out of this meeting tonight. It's interesting to see what's afoot at the White House. Thank you both.
Indeed. Thank you.
The powerful remnants of Hurricane Irma bringing record flooding to Jacksonville, Florida, washing out many of the city's streets. Coming up, the mayor of Jacksonville joins me to talk about the daring rescues that may have saved hundreds of lives.
You need to put a white flag or something that represents that where we can see you. And our public safety workers, our firemen, our policemen have stepped up.
As you get closer to the river, and you can look here at this Hyatt Regency underneath it, it's basically like a canal. The water is still coming up, and there are basically white caps here in the middle of Noonan Street in downtown Jacksonville, where officials for the last several days have been urging everybody in certain evacuation zones along the river to get out.
Wow, just incredible. When you look at the waters in Jacksonville, that was one place that before the storm hit, people weren't talking about. You know, where is it headed? Where might it hit? Where are people evacuating? Jacksonville, in my mind, wasn't even really on the radar. And as the storm rolled in and that surge, just look at that water, flooded the streets.
When you think about it, I mean, the eye came ashore pretty close to Key West, Cudjoe Key. Jacksonville is a 5-hour, maybe 6-hour drive away from there. It's on the northern end of the state and the East Coast.
Right.
The eye came ashore on the southern end of the state, the southernmost part of the United States. This was a monster storm, and look at all that water.
The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office tweeted out on September 12th. They said today, obviously this morning, we hope the 356 people who had their lives saved yesterday will take evacuation orders more seriously in the future. So they did feel like they had warned their residents to evacuate, to be serious. But obviously, you know, like ourselves, or some of us, at least myself, we didn't think of this as being an area that was a prime target, but they're saying, you know what, we told you to get out, and people had to be rescued. You saw someone swimming there.
This has been a killer storm, 35 deaths at least in the Caribbean, and that number almost certainly is going to go up. 7 deaths in Florida attributed to the storm, plus 3 in Georgia, and I believe 2 in South Carolina. So it is a killer storm. And, you know, they haven't gotten to some of the worst hit areas of the Keys. It is possible, although maybe not likely, but possible that they may find other victims who have not yet been located or recovered in the most damaged areas of the Florida Keys.
All right, I think we have Peter Ducey standing by now live in Jacksonville, Florida. And Peter, what is it like at this hour?
Melissa, we just got word from city officials that the shelter population is down to about 1,400 people. That is roughly half half as many people as they had in shelters in Jacksonville during the storm. Because the mandatory evacuation order has been lifted, a lot of people are returning home, but then many others are returning to scenes like this. The road just runs right into the St. Johns River, which is still occupying entire streets. You can see it's not just this side of the street, it is right over here too in the San Marco neighborhood, and the water gets really deep. We've actually seen some folks show up where it is still dry. They come as far as they can, and then they realize that they can't get close enough to go and inspect their homes because the water is too deep, so they still have no idea how bad things actually are at the end of the road. This is one of the neighborhoods where officials, one of the 15 neighborhoods where officials spent most of their time yesterday responding to 75 different emergencies. The Coast Guard was here as well. Units from Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky all contributing. So when you hear about people coming here from out of state to help, you get a sense of that with the Coast Guard response. And just to give you a sense of how the water is receding, but it's still a problem, these streets are flooded. The river is all the way over there. It's about a football field away. So it came all the way up onto these streets, through houses, clogged up storm drains, and a lot of the water is still standing there. So a big problem today, in addition to flooding, becomes bugs, and the city says snakes. They say they've already had more reports than normal of people getting bit by snakes in water where there's not supposed to be.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, another thing to worry about. Peter Doocy, thank you for that. John.
Do I see your skin crawling there?
Woo.
Snakes. The international community uniting and hitting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un with more sanctions. Coming up, we will take you live to South Korea. And later in the hour, in case you missed it our first time around, an American tourist escapes an island hit extremely hard by Hurricane Irma. The terrifying moments inside a resort and how he was able to get out.
And we heard that, that people were coming into different resorts, posing as, guests and stealing people's jewelry and belongings. It wasn't even just taking, water and food. It was just really scary.
So here's an example of a neighborhood pulling together in the aftermath of Irma. This is the Bel Air Food Mart in Bel Air, Florida. This is where most residents are still without power, including my extended family. That's how we got this video. Food is running low in the neighborhood, and the owner of this market moved a grill out front and started cooking eggs and bacon, really anything that he had inside. And you can see there a hungry crowd quickly formed. We are told they did charge a nominal amount to cover some of what they were losing, but quite a contrast to the looting that we're seeing elsewhere. And we wanted to show that to you because you want to celebrate some of the better things that have happened with neighborhoods coming together. But I know my in-laws were driving around looking for something. Oh, there's the Bel Air Food Mart. They're out there cooking on a grill in front. And the Mart didn't have power either, but, they're like, well, here's what we could do. Necessity is the mother of invention. These storms bring out sometimes the worst in people, but they also bring out the best in people. And you see that there. Yeah. That's really cool. Absolutely. The Department of Transportation down the Keys to inspect all the bridges because even though you can see that people are traveling, you're not sure that on the bridges they can take any significant weight. And so our Department of Transportation is working on that. Yeah, that's scary. Florida Governor Rick Scott speaking on the safety concerns with most of the bridges and roadway systems of the Florida Keys after Hurricane Irma, of course, wreaked havoc. Officials believe that serious damage was avoided to the 42 highway bridges that link that small string of islands together. Folks living in the upper Keys were allowed to return home today, but crews continue to inspect systems across the state before giving the all clear for people to travel. Joining me now is retired Lieutenant General Robert Flowers. He is a former Chief of Engineers and Commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you so much for joining us. It's good to be here. Yeah. As they go in and sort of survey this damage and try to make sure that everything is safe, what's job one?
Well, job one is to make sure that the search and rescue operations are ongoing and aren't hampered by the inspections. but it's very important to get an assessment of all of the critical infrastructure, because one of the things that's most important is to get essential services up and running for people. And that includes the ability to move, power, water, etc. So it's very important.
Another huge problem is just the standing water everywhere. I mean, we saw that in the pictures that we were looking at all the way up to Jacksonville, but it's sort of all over the place that you have this water. Now we're hearing reports there's snakes and other things in the water. Is that something that the Army Corps of Engineers can help with, pumping it out, getting rid of some of that?
Yes, it is. The Corps is at its best when it's responding to disasters like this. These are unprecedented. 2 Category 4s within 15 days, never happened before. But yes, it does. You are some at the whim of Mother Nature. You've got to allow it to drain, but you can inspect to make sure that there are no choke points and that the water is being allowed to drain as quickly as it can. And then pumping out sewers, tunnels, as we did in New York after Sandy, it becomes a critical operation.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the fact that we had these 2 back-to-back hurricanes devastating in 2 different states. How thin does that stretch the Corps of Engineers?
It really stretches it, particularly when you throw in the U.S. Virgin Islands and assistance there. It's a stretch, but they'll do the job. I have absolutely no doubt. The Department of Defense is really committed to being in there, and you see a full court press, and no one can respond with the communications, the energy, and the abilities that the Department of Defense brings.
You know, there was a discussion recently about having a permit czar, having someone on hand to sort of approve new permits and projects quickly so that folks can get going with the rebuilding effort. What's your opinion of something like that?
I absolutely think anything you can do to expedite the environmental permitting process will be great. Whether you are a government entity at any level, a utility, a private corporation, even a private citizen, you have to abide by the law. And if the law requires a permit to do something, then it has to be obtained. But it can be done in an expeditious manner. And there's been a lot of talk about expediting the permitting process. Well, Harvey and Irma give the nation an opportunity to put that to the test and to demonstrate that it can be done. We did it after Katrina, and to some extent we did it after Sandy. I know it can be done here.
Yeah. All right, Lieutenant General Robert Flowers, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
My pleasure.
Another big story today out of Washington, President Trump talking tax reform with 3 Democratic and 3 Republican senators tonight over dinner at the White House, just days after he struck a deal with the Democrats on hurricane relief and the debt ceiling. Why our next guest says this could represent a new strategy for this White House.
A Fox News alert, the UN Security Council taking unanimous action against North Korea, imposing new sanctions as the House Foreign Affairs Committee holds a hearing on the rogue regime. One witness slamming China for not doing its part. That a possible topic of conversation for Secretary Rex Tillerson, who will meet with top Chinese official later this afternoon.
I cannot tell the committee today that we've seen sufficient evidence of China's willingness to truly shut down North Korean revenue flows, to expunge North Korean illicit actors from its banking system, or to expel the various North Korean middlemen and brokers who are continuing to establish webs of front companies. We need to see that happen.
Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palkot is live in South Korea. Greg, what's the reaction?
Hi, Melissa. We are actually down in Pohang, South Korea. That's the southeastern part of the country, tracking some military maneuvers that we'll tell you about in just a second. But yes, there has been swift reactions to the UN Security Council resolution against North Korea. Predictably, from the regime of Kim Jong-un, you can imagine the reaction was negative. One official calling them evil, saying that North Korea would inflict the greatest pain on the U.S. after these sanctions. U.S. allies, South Korea and Japan, well, they were positive. China and Russia, they were calling for talks Analysts, well, they're not too sure. Now, if diplomacy does fail, the U.S. and South Korea are ready at least for a military option. Take a look at what we saw today.
This is about as close in feel as you're going to get to war on the Korean Peninsula, at least for now anyway. South Korean and U.S. Marines in a live fire exercise. Machine guns, mortars, grenades, artillery, all aiming down that valley at an armored position. Read that, the North Koreans.
Now, analysts say a conventional war with North Korea would not be pretty at all. Casualty figures easily in the hundreds of thousands over tough terrain like what we were seeing today. And while war in the Korean Peninsula seems remote, the possibility does exist, and why these folks do train. Take a listen.
Sure, a lot of people are focused on Peninsula, but for us, it's business as usual.
Business as usual, but some tough business.
Yeah, the Marine Corps is the nation's 911 force, and we're ready to answer the call.
Again, everybody we spoke to today, Melissa, said that this was purely defensive, and they pay no attention at all to the rhetoric, the actions north of the DMZ. But other people do, and that's why they are there. Back to you.
Yeah, Greg, I mean, does it feel like the tension is mounting there? I mean, I know you've been many times. Does it feel different this trip?
It does feel different, Melissa. A certain greater caution from the South Koreans. They're used to a lot of rhetoric, a lot of maneuverings by North Korea. But I think it was this nuclear test just a little more than a week ago that really focused attentions of the folks here. Evacuation plans being looked at that hadn't been looked at before. And certainly, as we saw today in those military maneuvers, the military of the government and the government itself taking on a much more proactive approach to the whole situation, Melissa.
Greg Palkot, thank you so much.
Now, this Fox News alert, President Trump inviting senators from both sides of the aisle tonight to talk tax reform over dinner at the White House. 3 Republicans from the Senate Finance Committee and 3 moderate Democrats set to join the president and Vice President Mike Pence this evening. This bipartisan dinner comes just days after President Trump struck a surprise deal with Democrats on hurricane relief and the debt ceiling. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen is live in D.C. with more on all of this. James.
John, good afternoon. The question confronting official Washington right now in the wake of last week's surprise compromise is whether it was a one-off event driven by timely imperatives or represents a new normal for a non-ideological chief executive. Republican congressional leaders insist, despite some whispers on Capitol Hill to the contrary, that they were genuinely surprised when President Trump, after what House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi called a very long, intense conversation, ended it by essentially caving to her team's short-term requests on hurricane relief, the debt ceiling, and government funding. To some, the gambit conjured memories of President Clinton's successful use of the tactic known as triangulation, wherein a chief executive, desperate for legislative successes after the failure of his health care overhaul effort, cobbled coalitions from both parties to achieve smaller, more limited objectives that nonetheless resonated with the electorate. And while the current crop of Republican leaders acknowledge that they are working with a GOP president who is not a movement conservative per se, they believe he sees the big picture, particularly the economy, from their perspective, not the Democrats. And they believe tax reform will wind up as a more typical case where the Democrats will not be receptive to triangulation.
This president is somebody who wants to get results for the American people, and so do we. And if that can happen in a way that involves Democrat support, that's absolutely something that we're for. But at the same time, we're going to try and move an agenda that we think is good for the American people, that's based on center-right solutions.
So that big meeting at the White House tonight at 6 p.m. an hour. Follow me on Twitter right now at James Rosen TV. And right after this segment, I'll tell you who coined the term triangulation to describe Bill Clinton's third way approach. John.
I think I know the answer to that. But,
but do you follow me on Twitter? That is the important
part. Of course
yes.
I do. Who better? Who better to follow? James Rosen, thank you.
That was a good tease. All right. An American tourist trapped on a Caribbean island during Hurricane Irma. How he got out and what he learned from the experience. Plus, the stock market seeing a relief rally, and the S&P 500 could have a record-setting day. But people living in Irma's path aren't so lucky. Our next guest talks about the cost of recovery. So during the first hour of Happening Now, we spoke with an American tourist who was rescued from the island of St. Martin. Adam Lynch says he was trapped inside a resort while Hurricane Irma moved through the island. Lynch says he and 3 others stayed in a bathroom for close to 8 hours, holding the door closed. Heavy rain and wind pounded the resort, forcing glass to shatter and cave in. Water was pouring in from the ceiling, the storm damaging 75% of the hotel. He said eventually they got a ride to the port, where he got on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship on Sunday afternoon. He called it a surreal experience.
Surviving the hurricane kind of put everything in perspective. So, we were 190 guests at that resort, mainly Americans, and I think there was a safety in numbers with all of us there. We learned after we got out from some of the resort staff that we got their information and were able to contact that as soon as we left, it really got substantially worse.
There were armed looters in town. Lynch says photos of the destruction don't do them justice. He says the earliest he'll be able to get home now is Thursday.
And this Fox News alert, the Dow in record territory after investors breathed a sigh of relief in the wake of Irma. This as some airports in Florida are reopening, and the national average price of a gallon of gas stands at $2.66 a gallon for regular. Dave Sampson joins me now to talk about the economic recovery after the storms. He was former Deputy Commerce Secretary for President George W. Bush, also the President and CEO of Property Casualty Insurers Association of America. It's hard, David, for me to believe that Wall Street is actually relieved by what happened after Irma. It looks like such a mess in Jacksonville all the way down to the Florida Keys.
It's all a matter of perspective, I guess. When you remember that prior to landfall, projections were based on the path of the storm at that time, that we could be seeing insured losses of $150 billion. Today, the best estimates are around $40 billion of insured losses. And so I guess you have to factor expectations into the equation or how bad things could have been.
The market doesn't like uncertainty, and the uncertainty of an oncoming hurricane well, sends the market into a tailspin. Now that we seem to have at least an early handle on the damages, you think this market is going to continue to turn north?
Well, I don't predict the markets, but what I can tell you is that property casualty insurers are prepared to surge an army of claims adjusters into the affected areas just as soon as we're given the all clear sign by state and local officials. And our #1 priority is getting checks into the hands of policyholders so that families can begin rebuilding their homes, getting cars back on the road, and businesses open again.
And that brings economic activity in and of itself. I mean, it's one of the silver linings, I suppose, of a storm like this is that, all of those people who have lost property and, had their cars flooded out and so forth, they're going to be running down to their neighborhood dealership or their neighborhood, superstore to buy the supplies they need to fix things up.
Well, I think projections are it is going to have a short-term impact on GDP. We can expect to see that when this quarter's GDP figures are produced. But there will probably be a spike in a number of areas in construction-related businesses and home furnishings, as well as in automobiles for a while. But certainly the dislocation caused by 2 historic storms, Harvey and Irma, are not something that are going to have a net positive impact on the U.S. economy.
Yeah, what about the refinery capacity in the wake of Harvey in particular? I mean, gas prices spiked after that. Is that a situation that's been pretty well dealt with now?
Well, it's going to take a while for all those refineries to get back up to full speed. I mean, this is one of the great concerns we had right after 9/11 when you looked at 30% of all U.S. refining capacity is in Houston, and we were worried about what would happen if that refining capacity was taken out. Well, now we can begin to see when that refining capacity is disrupted for a period of time, the impact it has on supply as well as prices. But this is a situation where they will get those refineries back up and running. Fuel supply is going to be very important for the recovery both of Houston as well as Florida, as all those people who evacuated are going to now have to get back home.
I'm frankly surprised that they're talking about getting the power back on pretty much statewide in the next 10 days or so. Hurricane Andrew was a less intense storm, covered a much smaller quadrant of Florida. And it took 10 days at least to get all the power back on after that storm that only crisscrossed the state. This one mowed all the way up to the north from the south.
Well, John, I think it's important to learn that for everybody who is involved in a response to a disaster like this, we learn from every disaster. We learn from Andrew in terms of building codes, in terms of the kind of responses that take place. We learn from Katrina. And so all of those learnings are built into everyone who has to respond. And I think you're also going to see one of the largest deployments of electrical company linemen. There are inter-service agreements with states all across the country, and other companies will be surging repair crews into Florida to help get that back up and running.
And should people who are insured, should they expect their company, their insurer, to pretty much write them a check on the spot?
Well, companies want to respond as quickly as possible. So my advice is, as soon as you can, call your insurance agent or call your company and let them know about the damage that you have. Be sure to take pictures and video of the damage. The great thing today is that technology plays a role in this. So many insurance companies have mobile apps and online ways to file claims. For the first time in a major disaster, you're going to see companies, insurance companies that will be using drones to help survey damage. All of that is going to speed up the process of getting checks into the hands of policyholders.